Hi, I'm thrilled to death that you were all here this morning because we're reaching the end, almost at the very end. Next week is the last week in our teaching series on the book of Esther. The entire book, the reason we did this was because given our current situation in the world and the way everything seems to be going the wrong direction, that God has put every one of us in a place for such a time as this. That where you are, the people you know, the people you work with, the people in your family, those that surround you, God put you there because He wanted you there and that He has a role for you to play. And so as we've gone through this story, and I would encourage you to go back and read if you haven't been following along, but we basically have said this. We said, look, what we've learned in this is that God is a God of providence and sovereignty, because we said His name doesn't even appear in the book of Esther, but He's at work behind the scenes. And what that means is that even in places where we wouldn't expect there to be opportunities, there are opportunities at play. And because sometimes that's hard to see, because life is difficult and trouble arises and there's problems in front of us, but in the midst of all that trouble and all those problems, God actually has a plan that He's working out because He's sovereign. Unfortunately, what that means for us is that there's some risks because we have to step into that plan in the midst of chaos and trouble. And that means that if we want to fulfill God's purposes in being where we are, where He's put us, we have to take some faith-filled risks. And that brings us up to where we are today. So, before we go on, let me ask you a question. Let me see if I see it. Actually, you know what? I'll leave that up. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever worked for someone in charge that was terrible at being in charge? Anybody? Yeah, every one of you should have your hands up, right? Okay, have you ever been in a classroom where the teacher had no clue? Yes, right? We all done that, right? They didn't understand what was going on. They didn't really get it, right? It's like, what are you doing? This doesn't even make sense. Have you ever talked to anybody that ever does the work here, right? Like, you're kind of like, what is going on? And you know what happens when that happens, right? People begin to not listen, and they dismiss, and they're like, they don't have a clue what they're doing. We're just going to do this, right? Or sometimes they subvert. Like, well, they don't know what we're doing. We're going to get rid of them, so we're going to start doing the opposite things. Right? This happens, and it can be really damaging, and it doesn't really matter where it is. It can be damaging in a family, in a company, in a corporation. Sometimes it happens on a grand scale. In World War II, before it started, Hitler actually made some amazingly brilliant decisions. It surprised his generals because they led to these decisive victories. But what they did was he began to be convinced of his own genius. And so as the war progressed and he led, he began to have such a high view of himself that he disregarded his advisors, he disregarded his generals, he began to make horrifically bad decisions. If you're a student of history, and you may not be, his decision to invade Russia and start two fronts, or declare war on the U.S. when the U.S. was trying to be neutral, and he kind of pulled them into the war, and there's just a list. And in the end, he got increasingly irrational. His own people tried to kill him before he ended up ending his own life. Now, that can be, that affected millions. But it actually hits every one of us, right? Whether it's in our government, the company we work in, our family, our church. But what I want to examine this morning is, what do we do when we begin to wonder if God is in charge? Like, have you ever thought, do you really know what you're doing? Right? Have you ever had that question? I mean, you know in your head, okay, God's God, so He must know what He's doing, but I'm not really seeing it right now. Like, God, are you paying attention? Right? Maybe you're busy, in Africa, and you forgot that I'm here, because life just looks like God is not really in charge. But what we're going to see as we reach the climax of the story today, that God is in charge, and there are some significant implications for you and for me in the midst of this. So we're in Esther chapter 6. If you're following along, you can do it on our app, you can do it in your hard copy Bible, whatever it is. I encourage you to follow along. But before we jump in, we have to set the stage, because it makes this chapter, which is, I think, my favorite chapter in the whole book. Esther's committed. Remember, she became queen through this whole set of circumstances, and she's committed to intercede for the Jews. And if you remember, she had two different opportunities to do so, once in the throne room and another time at the banquet. And whether it was because she was intentionally and very smartly planning, or just whether she was fearful, she has yet to make a request of the king to save the Jewish people who are under this edict of destruction. And while this is going on, Haman, the guy who started this whole thing, is so angry at Mordecai, her uncle, who's a Jew, and the one who kicked this whole thing off. And he's so frustrated, he's so angry that he decides he needs to die, and he needs to die now. Right? Even though he had this opportunity from his own edict to have Mordecai killed months and months from now, he's like, I'm not waiting. This guy is a thorn in my side. So he goes home, he complains, his family convinces him, all right, why don't you do it? Set up a stake, you can get him impaled on it. In fact, just go ask the king. And so the situation is that Haman's decided to do that. He's constructed this pole. He's going to go and see if he can get Mordecai killed before any salvation comes for the Jews. And of course, Mordecai and Esther are completely unaware of all this because this is all happening out of sight. They don't know what this is going on. And actually, as we come into chapter 6, Mordecai's life hangs by a thread, and it would take nothing for his life to be snuffed out. But God is in charge. And now we see coincidence after coincidence after coincidence. The author, Frederick Buechner, said, a coincidence is just God's way of remaining anonymous, which I love. And we're going to see that throughout this. And so it begins with the author recording coincidence number 1. That night, right, where he's had the banquet with Esther, it's all done, Haman left. That night, the king had trouble sleeping. So he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so that it could be read to him. He can't sleep. He tosses, he turns, nothing works. All the usual remedies don't work. Warm milk, counting sheep. I guess kings probably don't count sheep. Maybe he was counting money. I don't know. But all the things he normally did, they didn't work. And this isn't unusual. I'm sure this wasn't the only time this happened, but this night he finally gives up. I need help sleeping. Why tonight of all nights? After all, he just had a nice big banquet with lots of wine. You would think that would have knocked him out. How many of you slept pretty good last night? And we didn't even serve wine. All right. Enter coincidence number 2. In those records, he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the eunuchs who had guarded the door to the king's private quarters, which a little detail we didn't know from earlier. They had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. What reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this? The king asked. His attendants replied, nothing. Now, here's coincidence number 2. He's already ruled for years. This is not Xerxes' first 3 months on the job. So when he brings out the records, these are substantial. It's like picking a huge book and letting it fall open and saying, let's read something, and it's going to be really boring, so I'm going to fall asleep. But it just happens to land here. It just happens to get his attention. It just happens that he's not actually getting more sleepy, he's getting more engaged because he hears the story and he thinks, well, what's going on? How did this slip through the cracks? And you can see his mind beginning to race. Now he's for sure not going to sleep, but he's thinking, well, goodness, we gotta remedy this. We gotta make something happen. This injustice needs to be rectified. Which leads us to coincidence number 3. Who is that in the outer court? The king inquired. As it happened, another way of saying coincidentally, Haman had just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole he had prepared. And so the attendants, I would love to know what the attendants were saying on the side, because they see all this. They're probably gossiping, oh, this is going to be good, right? The attendants replied to the king, Haman's out in the court. Well, bring him in, the king ordered. And now, coincidence, 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 and the stage is set. So Haman came in. And the king said, what should I do to honor a man who truly pleases me? And Haman thought to himself, who would the king wish to honor more than me? Now, that has to be the definition of a megalomaniac. I'm not entirely sure. But if you actually think it through, it's a logical question. He's just been given power in the kingdom. He has the king's own signet ring, which is basically saying, you have my power. He just went to a banquet, which was the king, the queen, and him. And this next night, he's going to another banquet of just the king, the queen, and him. So there is some logic, even though it's a little megalomania going on here. And you can see, he's like, every indicator says, this is me. Now, the speed with which he pulls out this answer says to me, he's had this dream for a while. Because he replied, well, as a matter of fact, king, I got a solution for you. If the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with the royal emblem on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let him see that man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robe and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the officials shout as they go, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. And you got to picture Haman's thinking here. Look, I already got the king's signet ring. I mean, that's power. If I can get the king's robes, the king's horse, I have everything the king has except the queen. And I can see him going, this is going to be good. And in the next moment, all those coincidences come together, and the entire story of Esther spins 180 degrees, just like that. Excellent idea, the king said to Haman. Quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you said for Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing you have suggested. Now, we got to pause here for a second, because if you're paying attention, and you guys are smart people, you're thinking to yourself, how does the king not know that Mordecai the Jew isn't part of an edict to be destroyed? Like, why is he letting him honor someone who he's already signed an edict to kill? Doesn't that make sense? Like, isn't that a logical question? Like, is this king just that stupid, right? Or is he clueless? And there's a little more here than we probably have time for, but I'll give you a quick overview. In the original language that this is written in, there's some wordplay involved. So when Haman originally went to the king and said, there's a people, a disturbing people that you need to get rid of, the language he uses is one that could easily be construed as, they just need to be dealt with, they need to be made to be slaves, we need to do something. That's what he does verbally. It's not until he puts the order in writing and sends it out that he says they get to be annihilated, killed, and exterminated. And so there's this difference between what he wrote and what he told the king. And because the king and the palace is so insulated, it is highly likely the king never actually even saw the edict. Because remember, he just gave Haman his ring. He said, God, go for it. And so the king hasn't even made the connection necessarily that this is what's going on. And you're going to see again in a second why we think that's the case. So you got the king, he's like, wow, go do this for Mordecai. And of course, Haman had no choice. He did what he had to do. And we read afterward, Mordecai returned to the palace gate. I wonder how he felt after all this. But Haman hurried home dejected and completely humiliated. And you're thinking, yes, complete turnaround. By the way, what's really fascinating is the verse that comes after this, because it seems like his family turns on him. His family were the ones who just said, go build a pole, impale Mordecai on it, you're awesome. He comes home, and when Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends what happened, his wise advisors, here's what they said. Since Mordecai, this man who has humiliated you, like, look how they distance themselves really quick, like, he humiliated you, right? Since he's of Jewish birth, you will never succeed in your plans against him. It will be fatal to continue opposing him. If I was Haman, I'd be like, whoa, what's changed here? It's only been like 12 hours since we had our last conversation. But he has no time to think about it. Because while they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly took Haman to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And you can feel the story moving towards its conclusion, which we're going to look at in a second. But if God is in charge of all things, then there's a couple things we want to recognize in here. And here's the first one. Sometimes God delays an immediate outcome for a better one. Do you know if Mordecai had been recognized properly for foiling the assassination plot when it happened, none of this would have occurred. He'd probably be dead. And yet we do this all the time. We have these opinions on what God should do. Here's an expectation, God. Here should be the process. Here's the plan. Here's the path. It's so clear. We're like, God, can't you see this? Like, don't you understand this is the right way to go? This is the right thing that needs to happen. It's so obvious, at least to us. And then stuff doesn't happen. It's like the person who comes to know Jesus and they learn that God wants us to be generous. And so they're like, against all rational logic, they begin to give. And they say, okay, God, I'm going to take a risk. I'm actually going to give 10% of my income. You said if I do that, you're going to be faithful. And so they begin to be generous. They begin to give money away. And they are going above and beyond. And they say, okay, God, I did my part. Why am I having so many difficulties? Why is this not working out? Shouldn't you be blessing me? Isn't that what I heard? Why is this not happening? See, sometimes people don't change right away. Sometimes events or ministries fail. Sometimes relationships get worse. And there's two responses that we do typically when this happens, because we want this immediate outcome and God is delaying it because he says, I got a bigger, better plan. I'm in charge of this. But what we do is we do one of two things. Sometimes we try to take control back, because what we do is, okay, God, you're not doing what I want you to do. I'm going to take ownership of this back a little bit. Like, I was trusting you with this, but you are not really acting the way I want you to act, so I'm going to start, okay, we got to get something done here. And so we begin to try and pull the reins back and say, well, I'm going to make this happen. They're not changing? Well, they're going to change if I have to make it happen. Or you know what? That didn't happen. I'm going to push. And so we begin to push hard, and we begin to try and control things. We get tempted to do this. It's just a logical response. Or we give up. We become cynical. Jaded. You know what? This doesn't work. God really can't do what needs to be done. He really hasn't proven himself. Quite frankly, I'm not sure he values me or my life the way I thought he did. So whatever. In both of those, what we're doing really is we're questioning the omnipotence, the omniscience, and the goodness of God. God, you either don't know and don't care. You either don't know, are powerless, or you don't care. It's one of the three. And because of that, God, I can't see what you're doing. I don't really think you're in charge at all. With Esther, God saw the big picture and he played the long game. He knew the most effective course of action, and he knew when Mordecai's recognition would have the most value. Which leads us to our second point, which is this: seemingly unimportant details are often very instrumental to the working out of God's plan. The timing of events, the things they do, the words they say, they're small, but they can have huge implications. Have you ever thought, how would this story have worked out if any one of the three coincidences don't happen? What if the king went to bed and slept like a baby? What then? Maybe he wakes up really happy and Haman comes in, he's like, yeah, sure, do what you got to do. What if he can't sleep, but he opens the book and he ends up reading about taxes that were being paid in a far-flung province of the empire, and he's just like, oh, that's working, I'm going to sleep, right? What about that? Or what if he comes to the conclusion, but Haman decided never to come to the palace? Because this has implications even into the next chapter, which we're going to see in a second. Mordecai could have been executed, could have impacted what followed. We never know which details, which actions, which words God is going to use. And this is should be hugely encouraging for us for two reasons. One is we don't have to strive so much. We're trying so hard to get so many things done and to be so impactful when we have no idea what's going to be impactful. I mean, think about it. Think of that massive conversation you had with your children that one time where you were laying out your wisdom of the ages. You know, that conversation that you hope your kids go, oh my goodness, Mom, Dad, that changed my life. I just see things so much clearer now. I realize you're as wise as you ever said you were, right? Like, we hope that's going to happen. Never does. But how many times do your kids say, hey, Mom, Dad, do you remember when you said that thing? And you're like, no. And their life changed because God was at work. We don't have to try so hard. I can be faithful without carrying the results and the outcomes on my shoulder. But there's a second thing. It means anybody can make a huge difference. If God can use the smallest deal to make his plan work, then he can make a difference with you regardless of how you view your skills, your intelligence, your abilities, your opportunities, your finances. It doesn't matter. That should be great news. Because we can be like, okay, God, I'll do whatever you want. You get this. You can do amazing things through this. I'm just here. I'll use whatever I got. And I got nothing, but you know what? It's all yours. We read that, right? Didn't he say God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong and the foolish things to shame the weak? That's really good. And that sets us all up for what happens next. Because he's been rushed to the king's palace. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And on this second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king again, wine, more booze. King again said to Esther, all right, tell me what you want, Queen Esther. It's very interesting that he uses this title with her now. What is your request? I will give it to you even if it's half the kingdom. In other words, he's still feeling pretty good. He's in good spirits. And everything's been building up to this. And her request is fantastic, how she does it. We're going to pull it apart in a second. Queen Esther replied, if I have found favor with my king, if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been slaves, sold as slaves, I would remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king. Now, do you see what she does here? It's amazing. She's so good. She connects her life and the life of her people. She doesn't separate them, right? She's saying, I need you to spare my life and my people's life. She inextricably ties them together. So the king can't pull them apart. And then, and this is why we think that, Haman was playing word games with the king, she quotes the edict. Like this is new information for the king. Hey, I'd like your salvation and deliverance because we've been sold for killing, slaughter, and annihilation. In fact, she says, if we'd been merely sold as slaves, that seems to intimate that was Haman's original thing. Hey, there's a bothersome people, they need to be dealt with, and the king's impression was, okay, you're just going to subjugate them and make them slaves and servants. And she says, well, if that's all it was, I wouldn't have said anything. But here's what the edict says. And if you don't believe in coincidence, consider the perfect timing of this. How much more impact is this request going to have when the king had just honored a Jew? And if he hadn't honored the Jew, Mordecai, how would this have gone over? But it was fresh in his mind. So Esther goes for shock value here, and it works. Who would do such a thing? King Xerxes demanded. And remember, he's got a temper. We've seen this already. Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you? See what she did, right? Because his concern is her. But she's tied her well-being to her people's well-being. They're all together. Who would be so presumptuous? I don't know if Haman at this point is starting to shake, if he doesn't know, or if this is going so fast that he can't even process what's happening. Esther replied, this wicked Haman is, and look what she says, our adversary and enemy. It's you and me, king. That's the enemy over there. She's really smart. Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen, and then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and went out into the palace garden. Haman, however, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther. And why? For he knew that the king intended to kill him. She's identified Haman as a mutual foe. And his fortunes have gone from the highest of highs to the lowest of lows in the span of minutes. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining. Again, coincidentally, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. And the king exclaimed, will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my eyes? And now, understand what he's seeing here. He's given Haman the ring. He knew that Haman had asked for the robes, the horse, and everything else. What was the only thing Haman didn't have? The queen. You're going to do this? Just think of the story of Absalom and David. When he had rebellion, what did he do? He slept with King David's wives. This was a sign of power. He's like, really? You're going to do this right now? And I think it's funny because I think this has happened from time immemorial. If Haman truly was the kind of person we believe him to be, how do you think he treated the people that were lesser than him? Probably pretty miserably. Dismissed them, didn't care about them, whatever. And so as soon as this happens, I think this is great. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, he said, I got an idea. Hey, king, I got an idea. Haman set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He was going to use it to impale Mordecai. You know the guy you honored? The man who saved the king, in case you forgot, who saved you from assassination. Like this, it's just fantastic, right? Esther doesn't have to say anything. Then impale Haman on it, the king ordered. You can lead this king wherever you want him to go. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. And the ultimate irony in all of this is Haman is executed for a crime he never even intended to commit. It's a wonderful story, isn't it? The enemy of the Jews is dead. But I think there's another lesson that comes out of this. Not only do we already see that God works through the small things and that sometimes he delays what we want because he's got a better timing and a better plan. That should lead us to this, that we cannot miss the good that God is doing through our bad experiences. We have a tendency, because God does use negative, even evil circumstances and people to accomplish his plan. He didn't just overcome Haman, he used Haman to do something amazing. Because no matter how much power people have, no what position they're in, there is only one God. There's only one God who's in charge of this world, our country, our company, our government, our families, our world. There's only one. God is in charge of all things. It is very easy for us to see our bad experiences and assume that only bad will come, and our whole job is just to minimize the bad. Well, we'll try and do the best we can. We'll just try and deal with it. No. God's saying, no, I can do more. There's so much more hope here. And that, we know this. If you go to Romans, you guys all know this verse. If you're on the church, we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. And that's not a pie-in-the-sky statement. It's not one of those statements that just says, oh, God's going to be nice to us and I won't have any bad things happen. No. It's a statement that says, in the midst of the worst stuff that can happen in this life, God is at work and can do good. It's actually interesting. Thomas Nast, he was a very famous political cartoonist in the 1800s, so you probably haven't heard of him. He began his famous cartoon attack on the Democratic guy. His name was Tammany Hall. He ruled New York City. He was he was called William Boss Tweed, and he was just not a good guy. And he was so pressured by these political cartoons of Nast and his caricatures, he became internationally famous. He actually fled to Europe. There was just so much pressure, just because this guy was criticizing him and pointing out all his problems and issues, that Tweed traveled to Europe, except that the caricatures and the things that he had written actually made him so famous that he was recognized internationally, even for his crimes. He was actually arrested in Spain in 1876. And it was fascinating to me because the story illustrates this timeless principle. It was true of Haman, and it's true today, that God is in charge. And when it's time for someone's judgment, when it's time for something to happen, it's going to happen. God's got it. He's in charge. So we don't want to miss that God is doing good even when things are bad. Because if we don't believe this is so important. If we do not buy into this concept right here, then when we get hit by the devil or bad circumstances, the only thing we're going to do is react to what we see. I just got to react to what's in front of me. I guess I got to do what I got to do. And God becomes an addition to the equation instead of central. So, there is a question that's facing all of us every day. God is in charge of all things. We see it all the way through this book. Sometimes he delays one outcome for a better one. He uses the insignificant, the small little things, the words, the statements, the actions that we would dismiss. Sometimes he uses them to accomplish his purposes in amazing ways. And as he does that, we recognize that he can actually use evil people and bad circumstances to accomplish something good. We don't know how long God's going to take to put it all together. There's too many pieces in this. The puzzle's too complicated. Too many things God has to do. But here's the question that I want to leave you with today. God is in charge of all things. Will you let him be in charge of your life? It's really the question of Esther. It's really the question for anybody who claims to be a Jesus follower. Will you truly submit and humble yourself in everything to the one who is ultimately in charge of it all? He said to those who would follow him, take up your cross and follow me. Do you know what that means? That means I'm going to trust your timing, God. Even when I want it to happen now, I'm going to trust you in this. I trust your timing. It means I'm going to let you use any and everything, anybody, any situation, any circumstances, to know that you'll actually use bad and evil for my good. And I will commit to fight my tendency to be disappointed and disillusioned, and I will not let it damage my trust of you. People disappoint. Sometimes it feels like God disappoints. Things don't turn out the way we wish. Our church lets us down. Our coworkers take advantage of us. Marriage isn't what we hoped. And in the face of all of that, it is so easy to let that set our outlook for who God is and what he's doing in our lives. It's natural, makes sense, I get it. But God is saying, look, I'm inviting you into something that's so much better than that. To surrender despite your experiences. To say, look, I don't see it, I don't understand it, I don't get your timing, but I hope and I trust in you, and you have to be enough. To keep our belief from being just intellectual only, while our hearts try and protect ourselves. My friends, God is at work. He's at work in you. He's at work in the people around you. He's at work in your circumstances. He's using all those little things. And sometimes, God does let it get worse before it gets better. Someone said this, he may take you to rock bottom so you can discover that he's the rock at the bottom. I thought that's pretty good. But his promise for us is that if we trust him, he'll work things out for our good. He promised that he'll work according to his good pleasure. He promised that we'll never walk alone. He promised that he'll take care of us. And so he gives us this open invitation to seek and to ask and to knock. God is in charge of all things. Will you let him be in charge of your life?